Pulling apart colors in autumn landscapes. Welcome to the final part of this tutorial where we will work on creating depth through harmonizing color. I've selected this image because it potentially has a lot of different colors to work with. I'm saying potentially because it was quite flat. Let's take a look at what we have straight from the camera. It's very green and washed out now, so let's start by warming it up. We can now lower exposure a bit to allow more detail in the waterfall. Next, we'll work on each slider to get the most from it in the raw stage. Notice how much the contrast and highlight sliders are doing to the waterfall. Ideally, I'd like the long exposure water just off-white. The reason is that we can introduce color to it later. Speaking of coloring photos, I will double process this image. One is meant for the overall atmosphere, while another is for the water. Shadows and blacks are used to control detail of the darker parts of this shot, but I don't want the darkest parts completely black. At this stage, it's about keeping a close eye on the histogram to extract data from the raw file. That means keeping the whole image rather flat. Let's add a linear gradient from the top. Bring up the shadows and blacks here to push the background into the distance. But I'll use the subtract button to brush out the foreground boulder. As this appears closer than the actual background, it needs deeper blacks. From the start of this image, I imagined light streaming in from behind the boulders and bridge. Let's add a radial gradient first. I'll hover over the radial gradient 1 text until 3 dots appear. Then I'll point to intersect mask with luminance range. I explained how this tool works in detail in the last part of this tutorial. For now, I'll restrict the edits to the highlights and soften the transition. Increase both the exposure and whites to start adding light back there. It's always a good idea to check whether or not dehaze and clarity can help you out in these cases. I often find that a hint of negative dehaze and clarity yield nice results, but certainly do not overdo it this early. Next, I'll click Add and create a new brush to illuminate certain areas even more. Create another radial gradient and place it over the center of the gap. Then we have to add a bit to the right and remove a bit from the left. In order to do that, I'll intersect the mask with a brush and paint over the right side of the gap. Now I'll select a big soft brush for the light streaming in from the top right behind the boulder to the bottom left in the foreground. But instead of adding more light to this adjustment, I'll remove light from the surrounding area by inverting the mask. Increase the shadows to still allow shadow detail in there despite the pretty hefty vignetting. Looking closely at the histogram, we have a bit of leeway in the extreme shadows, but not much. Let's dial back the black slider a bit. Speaking about leeway, it's easier to find and adjust colors if we increase vibrance and saturation here. We'll start with a first pass of color adjustments. Go to the color mixer. In the Hue tab, pull the yellows towards orange and the greens towards aqua and teal. This will create a first pass of separating crucial colors. In the Saturation tab, I will push the oranges, yellows, and greens with the sliders showing a gradual bump. Yellows will be increased the most. The leaves start to look much better already, but brown pebbles beneath the surface look distracting, especially in the corner. I'll add a radial gradient and selectively try to lower the bottom right's brightness and saturation, and shift the hue towards the watercolor. We need another pass of this, but I'll use a brush for more control. Go to the Detail tab and drag the radius all the way down, then increase sharpening to about 40. Masking will hide it from even areas such as sky and deep shadow. Very useful if you're dealing with smooth water and skies. Also, increase noise reduction and color noise reduction by a couple of points whenever you increase exposure or shadows. Next, I'll show you an alternative to warping in Photoshop. Using the Geometry tab, you can strengthen the composition a fair bit. I'll click the little checkbox before mashing it up so that each adjustment will automatically crop the shot. No right or wrong here. Feel free to experiment with this on your own photos. In general, what I'm trying to achieve is a tighter crop, with an emphasis on the wide-angle lens's natural distortion. I've added a short video explaining the next step in the folder Utility Videos. We're going for ProPhoto RGB, 16 bits in 99% of forests. The next step is a bit different. Because I want to process this differently later, I'll open this one as an object. Raw smart objects can be entered again, so we can make adjustments like white balance. You lose that option when you simply open a file. I'll rename this one to neutral color, then right-click it, New Smart Object via Copy. That's different from duplicate because this will let you edit the copy differently. Choosing duplicate will apply any edits to all copies. I'll rename this Blue Water and double-click it to enter Camera Raw again. In here, you'll notice that all our adjustments are still visible, but we will cool the image down a bit and concentrate on the water's color. It looked a bit dirty before, which I don't like. Blue has a serene quality to it, which nicely fits the color harmony we're going for. We also have a bit of wiggle room to add whites, which intensifies the streams in the waterfall, but also increases saturation somehow. You might want to tame or exaggerate the effect by adjusting the highlights. It depends on the shot you have. I'll want to change the color of the water next, which is still reflecting quite a lot of green. I dropped my polarizer in a pool much like this earlier this week. It just slid off the filter holder and gone it was. Story time later. Let's add another brush and pull that temperature down a bit. If you're having trouble getting the color right, I suggest you use the tint slider to control the exact shade of blue. It could use a bit of saturation. Intersect that mask with a luminance range to restrict it to the darker parts of the water. This will remove that oversaturation. It will also emphasize the foamy bits and the 3 waterfall reflections. Make sure that the right transition handle goes way into the highlights, otherwise it looks like you stickered the bright areas on there. I'm not quite happy with the hue or saturation, so I'll tweak the colors a bit more. Let's create a new brush and have another pass at it. I'm painting over the darker parts of the water only. Darken this down a bit by bringing the exposure, highlights, and shadows all down. I'll add 2 points of whites for the foam. Also, cool that off a bit more by dragging the temperature slider to the right 5 points. And if the insane amount of local adjustments wasn't enough, we'll add another radial gradient. Place that in the bottom right corner. Lower its exposure, but raise the shadows to prevent clipping. I don't think I've shown you the next step before. Scroll all the way down to the Calibration tab. Here, you can control the exact hue of each color primary. That means you can shift the RGB colors any way you like. Again, I'm only interested in the water's color at the moment. The core of this part of the tutorial is color adjustment. You know what? Let's throw another linear gradient on there to finish it off. This is just for shifting the color a bit more towards the magenta to offset the change to the hue we made in the Calibration tab. Hide the top layer and add a white mask to it. We're going to be using the Channels palette and TK Multimask a lot. If it's not visible, Channels is usually next to the Layers palette. If it isn't, go to Window and make sure Channels is checked. I just undocked, pulled it out from the layers. That works like this. Now cycle through the channels by simply clicking them. The image changes to black and white in different ways. We can use that difference to our advantage. If you control-click a channel, the light parts will be loaded as a selection. Go ahead and select the red channel, then Control-Shift-click it to double that selection. This will expand the amount of reds. Now make the top layer visible and start painting out the autumn leaves with a black brush. It might take a while before you notice a difference. That's probably due to the low opacity setting of the brush. Let's hide that layer to see the difference in the water. Shift-click that mask to see what the mask offers to the image. We're going to do so much more though. Double processing is just the start. Deselect your current selection first. Let's add a couple more brush strokes to the top half of the image, excluding any water. Through a clever combination of channel selections, you can make really intricate color selections as well. Here is red plus red plus red plus red minus blue minus blue. Again, refer to the included utility video on making channel selections. Let's make a new channel from that selection. Now when we click it and see what's going on there, we see that the midtones are selected. Let's rename that channel and see if we can make an even more detailed selection of the orange leaves. Click the RGB channel again to resume normal editing, then point to TK Multimask and the top second from the right button for hue masks. Pick a color that's a good starting point for making a selection of the orange leaves. Now this already looks like a nice restricted selection of just those leaves, but if we drag the black and white slider up, we can increase it. The slider next to it will determine its transition. More to the right is a more gradual transition. The top slider expands into other hues. Let's make a selection of this and adjust the colors using a novel approach. Let's use the powerful Channel Mixer Adjustment layer. A channel mixer controls how much of the RGB light is added to create the color and brightness you see in the result. So when we increase red in the red channel, we're saying, please increase the way red is contributing to the red channel. It's not easy to wrap your head around this. It took me years to figure this out and really use it to my advantage. Go ahead and select the blue channel, then decrease the blue slider in there to start. This balances out the exposure. You might have guessed that we're going into the green channel next. When we decrease the greens here, we're actually introducing magenta. Autumn leaves contain a lot of green aside from red to make yellow. Increasing the red slider in the green channel will make it more green. So I'm pulling back the blues in here a bit to balance out the color towards yellow. Go back to the red channel. If you mess around with the constant slider, you see what a dramatic change that offers. It quickly becomes too much. That's why I like to use a combination of channel mixers on different selections. Here we just did one pass on a tight selection of orange. Hide that first channel mixer, deselect, Ctrl D, and enter TK Multimask again. We'll be adjusting the greens next, so pick a color that represents a nice middle ground of all the moss in the image. As you can see in the selection preview, the black and white representation, we have actually selected much of the oranges again. But instead of redoing the selection, we can adjust the two circles on the rainbow slider to shift the hue selection more to the green spectrum. Notice that the red leaves are being dropped from the selection and not much remains. Now let's increase the black and white slider. Better already, but I'm afraid the transition is too harsh. Let's drag the transition slider to the right and select a bit more lime green too. That should do it. Let's make a selection from it with the dotted square, then add a new channel mixer. Go into the green channel, then allow more green in there by increasing the green slider. As before, the red slider also increases green because we are still in the green channel. Instead, let's drop the reds a little and increase the blue slider, then go into the blue channel. If we drop the blue slider, there the amount of yellow will increase. That's because yellow and blue are opposite colors in the color wheel. So when we drop the reds in the red channel, cyan is the color that will start to come through more. Let's do that with the green slider too. Deselect, then hide that latest channel mixer in the Layers palette too. Fire up Multimask and select a dark, cool green. What a great original color! You'll notice right away that it barely selects anything. I'm pushing the hue into the cyan, teal, aqua, whatever you might call it. Then let's increase the selection with the black and white slider. Leave the transition somewhere in the middle and create a selection from it. It's safe to unhide the previous channel mixers so you can see what you're working with when we add another channel mixer on top. This one is meant to push the dark evergreens into the teal a bit more, so in the blue channel, push both blue and green. We're blasting it in the green channel. I'll add a little bit of everything except for green itself. Even the constant slider gets a bump. That brightened up the dark greens quite a bit. Let's temper that. Go to the red channel next and lower both red and constant. Now lastly, in the blue channel, I'm going to alter the colors just a tiny bit. Let's check out the difference. Now these channel mixers, combined with hue masks, are at the core of this part of the tutorial. If you learn one thing, it has to be this, because you can pull apart hues and make each more saturated and really work on color harmonies. I think the dark greens look a bit too bright still, so let's pull it back a bit. Control-click the Channel Mixer 2 mask, then Control-Shift-click it. Add a new exposure adjustment layer, then drop the exposure about 1/10 of a stop. I always check if gamma correction makes a good difference in here, but it doesn't do anything for us here, so we'll leave that. I've renamed the channel mixers. Let's Control-click the Red Leaves one. Then let's add a new selective color adjustment layer. For the reds, let's increase yellow and decrease cyan. In yellows, we're increasing yellow and dropping blacks. Let's go back into reds. As I'm looking at what this does to the leaves, I notice that I want less green in those autumn colors. Increase magenta. Like I said before along the way, neutrals is perhaps the most crude or powerful adjustment. Let's push the yellow and magenta. Now pull out cyan to increase the amount of red. Remember, opposite colors on the color wheel. We'll drag that color balance to the top, then group all those adjustment layers and rename it. Check out the difference. Now that we've established the color harmony, we will continue to beautify the image. Let's start by cloning out distracting elements. On a new layer, I like to zoom way in there and pan along the edges of the frame to see if there are elements that can pull the eye away. Bright spots and saturated colors at the edges of the frame can and will pull attention away from the center. Because we covered my signature light effects before, I'll move a bit quicker this time. I'll create a group containing several other groups. We're going to add an Orton effect, light bleed layers, and diffuse light, all to add mood and depth to the image. Let's start by selecting the brightest parts of the image through Lights 2 in Multimask. Create a new layer inside Diffuse Light and point to Edit, Fill. Fill it with a bright yellow. Then deselect and select a bright yellow as the foreground color and add a couple of brush strokes near the right edge of the gap. We want light to be appearing to stream in from behind there. Now select a slightly warmer, more saturated color. Paint that color in too, but make it appear as if there is more color and brightness to the right edge than there is to the left. Deselect by pressing Ctrl D, then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and pull the radius all the way to the right and press OK. We need to mask out quite a bit because I actually only want it in the background to make it appear farther away than it currently is. I'll add a black mask and selectively add in that diffuse light layer. I think that saves a bit of work as opposed to masking most out. Cool, let's work on light bleed now. This is how I often do it. I'll create a whole bunch of new layers inside a group. I'll then set most of them to the soft light blending mode. I'll select a warm color here and paint in the origin point of the light on the first layer. Let's use the next layer to increase the impact of that origin point. Set to the hard light blending mode, you can really make those edges glow. Especially when combined with a third layer set to linear dodge, add. Now, I usually throw these add and hard light layers on later and work with progressively larger brush sizes on the other layers. All the other soft light layers stacked on top of each other build upon the stuff below it to expand the light in darker areas. If it doesn't add too much for you, try to either increase the opacity of the brush or setting the layer to overlay. But be aware that, especially in the case of overlay layers, that the effect quickly becomes too much, so better lower the layer opacity. Cycle through the layers and see if adjusting the opacity of each one results in a better and more convincing light bleed effect. Just a couple more brush strokes on the add layer at the edge. If we now turn off the entire group, we'll see immediately what light bleed can do for scenes like this. Add a white layer mask to this group. But if the light were to be streaming in from behind the big boulder, we better mask out those darker parts. Select Darks 3 in Multi-Mask. This top right levels icon lets you adjust the current preview. We're going to increase the selection's contrast to exclude the background. The gap is almost completely black, while the bridge and boulders are white. Let's create a selection from this. With black as the foreground color, mask out that light from the darker areas using the brush tool a bit. That looks better. Let's put the Orton effect group to the top of these effects. Press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E, also known as the claw. Then make sure that merged layer is inside the Orton effect group. Lower its opacity to about 20%, then go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and input a value close to 1.5 times your sensor resolution. This isn't an exact science. None of it is really, so watch the image closely and see if the radius floats your proverbial boat. We do need a brightness contrast adjustment layer on this blurry stuff. It makes the blurred parts glow. A more conservative approach works for this image. Again, I only want this light effect applied to the background, because the more atmosphere you look through, the more haze it brings. So with a black mask as a basis, we'll paint in with white to add in the Orton effect selectively. Alright, let's check out the entire Light FX layer. In my other video tutorial titled Light FX, I go into more detail about all this. Hide the whole Light Effects group for now, then use Multimask to select Darks 3. Whoops, I forgot to add a mask to the Light Effects group. If I do that now, the current selection will mask out all the dark parts. So I'll create a new temporary channel, deselect, and create a new white mask on the Light Effects group. Now, when we control-click that channel, we immediately load the Darks 3 selection again, a handy way to save certain selections. I'll start by removing a bit from the shadow parts of the distant trees to convey the direction of light. Next, I'll mask out a bit of the foreground too, using a low opacity brush. Press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E and pull that merged layer to the top. Then enter Camera Raw Filter through the Filter menu. We're going to increase the glow using a local adjustment in here. Create a new radial gradient and place it over the origin point of the light bleed. Now increase the blacks and whites. Pull dehaze and clarity to the left to really make that effect come through, then adjust the temperature to offset the color shift. It's not enough, so we need an additional color in there to help with correcting the color shift introduced by negative dehaze. Okay, the color looks good now, but it can benefit from a touch more exposure. Let's try lowering the highlights and whites to protect the histogram. Lowering the shadow slider already removes some of this effect from the boulder and bridge. Let's add a brush to this adjustment and paint in a bit more above the bridge as well. Create a new radial gradient next. Make it a bit smaller and place it over the origin point of light 2. Then increase whites, exposure, and temperature, then add a warm color to it too. Then lower clarity and dehaze while increasing the blacks to make that glow nearly twice as strong. We'll make it even warmer. That's a powerful effect. Let's control that a bit by adding a black mask to that new layer, then hide the light effects layer for now. Because I want to restrict this effect to the gap or clearing above the waterfall, I'll use the polygonal lasso tool to select it manually. Another new trick. Press Q on the keyboard to enter the quick mask mode. This is meant to adjust the current selection. Let's brush out the red area from foreground elements using a white brush. Think about where the light would reflect in the foreground and leave that intact. Erase the red from the shadow parts on the left side instead. Try to soften the edge with a soft brush. Then I will blur the red area on the left to create a light fall-off effect. The more distant the light, the less powerful it is. If you end up with something looking like this, it's time to press Q again. This will transform that red area into an unselected area. But we need to inverse that selection. Press either Ctrl-I or go to Select Inverse. Now we can paint on the area inside the gap to add the effect exactly where we want it. Drag the extra glow layer inside the light effects group. Unfortunately, that group's mask doesn't quite fit the effect we just added. So let's delete that mask and create a new one. Luckily, we already have a shadow mask in the channels palette from before. I'll use that to lightly paint out the darker parts of the background. Much better. We're adding in a moody curve now. Add a new Curves adjustment layer, then drag it to the top outside of the light effects group. Maybe you remember this from the previous part of the tutorial. We lower the midpoint and raise the black point in the curve. I usually do the same for the blue curve within the same adjustment, but I'll create a new Curves adjustment just to have more control. This curve takes care of split toning or color grading, in which you give certain brightness levels another color. They do that a lot in cinema. Using a low opacity brush, I will mask out that effect from the top part, but also from the bright center because it looks a bit too yellow now. Let's hide both curves and the light effects group. Then select Darks 4 using TK Multimask. Make the other adjustments visible again, then create a new layer and set it to Multiply. We're going to burn or darken the deepest shadows using this layer. I'll rename the layer accordingly, then select a dark indigo brush. This will emphasize the texture in the rock. Press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E and rename it to Dodge Tool. Then select the Dodge tool from the Tools palette. With it set to midtones and an opacity of about 12%, I'll paint in little details. The Dodge tool pushes the levels of small areas. This will both increase the exposure and saturation of areas where you painted in, but layers like this are destructive, which means you can't go back and readjust the brush strokes. You can only undo strokes or mask out the results selectively later using a layer mask. I sometimes lower the opacity in particularly bright areas. Check out this boo-boo I made. There's a hard edge still visible from that extra glow layer. We'll take care of that later. Let's paint in a bit of reflected light on the right edge of this tree right here. I'll continue to work to dodge remaining areas. Let's take care of that hard edge now. Remember that I said such a dodge layer is destructive editing? Now we need to mask out the hard edge in that dodge layer too. I've hidden the layers up until the clone distractions layer. Then I'll press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E to create a new merged layer from there. I'll rename that to Natural Dodge and pull that to the top. There are more ways than one to dodge or highlight areas. I'll make all the other layers visible again. On the top layer we just created, we'll enter Camera Raw Filter again. Using a combination of exposure, whites, contrast, shadows, texture, clarity, and negative dehaze, we can really push the brightness. Then I'll add a black mask to that new layer and introduce just a hair of that added brightness to areas that could benefit from it. But instead of painting it in freely, I like to restrict it to the bright greens initially, so Control-click the green channel. Maybe a bit more. Control-Shift-click the green channel 5 times. Then subtract the extreme highlights from the selection by Control-Alt-clicking the red channel. Hide the selection edges with Control-H, then select the brush tool. Using white as the foreground layer, paint in the dodging layer. That's a bit much. Lower the opacity of the brush, then start by dodging additional details found in the shadow regions. All that moss and lichen will look great after this. Let's set the layer blending mode to lighten, just to be sure that we don't accidentally darken areas too. What follows is me dodging the whole image, concentrating on the edges. Let's continue how I lost my polarizer and why it's important. I use a polarizer in the field not just when water is the dominant feature of an image. Wet areas in the forest create uncontrollable highlights in any forest shot when you don't use a polarizer. Polarizers make the image a bit darker too, so oftentimes you need to lengthen the shutter speed to compensate for the loss of light. Of course, that is great for when you're at a waterfall like this. I usually aim for a shutter speed of around 1/8 of a second for this type of smoothing. But when I was at that other pool, the element of the filter holder that connects the pane to the lens adapter came off. It and the filter fell in. Luckily, I brought my old polarizer, but I had dropped that years ago in Norway. Sorry, I had cold hands and no grip. That old thing did survive the fall, but the corner was cracked, and since the front part of the new filter holder was lost as well, I had to hand-hold the filter in front of the lens for the remainder of the tour. So that's how this image was created, me standing on a slippery rock covered in mud, moss, and water, while hand-holding a cracked polarizer in one hand and my tripod in the other. It must have been a sight when another photographer joined me and my buddy down there. I looked like a guy who just found some stuff to take a picture with. Everything covered in dirt, too, from the trip through the Alps we did. By the way, do you see how I light up those edges? That's really useful to emphasize depth into your own images. Works with mountains, too. We're almost done. I usually speed up these boring parts, but since I wanted to tell you that story, I figured, let's show you this in detail. Let's zoom out, increase the brush size, and do a couple more strokes here and there. Oh, I also like how the edges of those rocks are lit up. Let's emphasize that by dodging them a little. Now I notice those trees in the background. If we dodge those on the right side, it will convince the viewer that there was actually light from the opposite side. Let's control-click the red channel to restrict the dodging to the bright red colors, then press Ctrl-H to hide the selection edges. Now I'm taking a bigger, low-opacity soft brush to go over those bushes on the side where they seem to catch light. Let's do the same for the blue channel, then dodge the water a bit near the top. Let's pull that opacity right down and do this again. Better click a couple of times with a low opacity than everything at once. Let's now dodge those streams of water. We're nearly there. Just press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E once more and name the new merged layer Final Adjustments. Let's hop into Camera Raw Filter. First, we're going to make the central light just a bit more evocative. Put a radial gradient over the light's center, then hit Subtract. Then we're going to erase the right boulder from the gradient. Now for the fun part. Let's make it a tad brighter using exposure and blacks first. Then increase the warmth by pushing temperature about 20 points, then increase tint by about 8 points. I'm using a combination of negative dehaze and clarity, then a bit of extra texture to blur that area, then add detail back. Shift the saturation slider to taste. I'm going to adjust the overall brightness using a variety of slider combinations. As before, I don't have go-to settings for the Lord of the Rings look. It's all about what's right for this image, my precious. I like how negative highlights reel in that brightness a little while it still attracts a lot of attention. Go into the Global Adjustments and scroll down to the Detail tab. Zoom in to see how far you can push the sharpening slider without it all turning to Rice Krispies. As for the radius, I like to keep it anywhere from 0.9 to 1.5 at this stage. Then I'll put detail to about 30% and slowly increase masking. I'll hold Alt down while sliding masking up to see if there are key areas, black, that will not receive this sharpening. Like before, I'm adding a last light effect to the scene. I kind of invented this trick myself and coined it specular highlights. Using a brush, I will pull clarity way to the left and blacks up a bit. Other sliders also contribute, but to a lesser degree. Alright, let's make those bright highlights glow mysteriously. I think it's a nice touch finishing off any forest image. Under the Effects tab, I'll add a bit of vignetting to draw the eye inward. The highlight slider protects some of the highlights in that vignette, keeping them from looking muddy. Let's add a final pass of dodging. It's basically a brush in which we push the white slider. I'll bump the exposure of it a little, then pull back the whites a bit. I just noticed that the trees up there are a little too bright for my taste. I'll add a brush, then darken the trees. Let's drag that brush lightly along the full edge of the frame. I darkened the top tree too much, so I'm masking that out. As a last step, I've added the type of sharpening you can see me add in the included utility videos, then saved it. Let's have a look at the before and after. Thanks again and again that you've purchased this video. It means a lot that I can continue to produce these thanks to your help.